The orbital academy rotated in slow silence above a blue world that looked peaceful from this height, a glossy marble that had never once witnessed the annual war without weapons. Beneath the station's transparent dome, the largest simulation field in the academy stretched like a miniature continent. Ruined plazas, broken towers, alleys cut like canyons, scaffolds frozen mid-construction above drainage canals, and open quadrants marked with concentric circles where the scoreboard would eventually cast the colors of pride and shame. Sound rose from the galleries in layered waves, cadets off duty, instructors sharp in tone, sponsors in immaculate uniforms, past champions with scars that drew respect like gravity. The rule chimes rang 3 times, a clear metallic pulse that reflected off railings and girders. Mason Hale stood with his hands at his sides and felt the vibration run through boot soles into bone. He had imagined this moment in 100 variations since he had earned the slot as the lone human entrant. Most versions had included an early mistake. He had tried to rehearse the sensation of the error so it would not surprise him. He had told himself that prepared shock was less lethal than raw panic. The announcer's voice filled the dome, polished and cool, as if the owner had already practiced eulogies for this class. War without weapons, simulated urban theater, no firearms, no edged offense, no concussive devices, no powered tools, no drones, no chemical agents beyond field ration contents, no augmentation outside baseline medical support, field salvage allowed, improvisation encouraged, violations trigger immediate expulsion and class demerits carried to graduation review. Mason let the words pass through him. He had recited them nightly for a month, more ritual than study. Beside the human formation, the Vorthon cohort stood in dark plate harness that looked ceremonial, but had an obscene practicality in how it redirected blunt force. Sergeant Yixar, last year's runner-up and a personal myth to first years, rolled shoulders like armored hills. Farther down the line, Remnari scouts whispered in song speech that barely stirred the air, eyes hooded against glare, every stance waited for sudden explosion into motion. Thrick's cadets clicked mandibles softly, a choir of pins tapping glass, their gaze roving across distances with alien ease. Mason did not bother counting rivals. He had tried that in the preliminaries and had lost focus halfway through, eyes snagging on some pointless detail, mind stretching in 2 directions at once. He had promised himself a different discipline today. Count the rules, count breath, count sound, ignore the thunder around conscience. Cadets, the announcer continued, you will begin at the southern cordon in 3 minutes. Your objective is simple. Capture and hold the central zone for an uninterrupted count of 1,000 seconds. Scoring assigns elimination status to any cadet struck by a verified environmental hazard or a triggered sensor in red band. Strikes to non-registered zones will earn no credit. Collisions, falls, and panic injuries are your responsibility. Med teams will stand by. Remember the spirit of the test. Ingenuity under restraint. A murmur of approval rippled across the Vorthon section. The Remnari lifted chins in the direction of the central zone, as if scenting victory on air. Mason rolled his shoulders and examined the floor at his boots. The plating had been replaced since the last hull drill. The new surface had a faintly different pitting pattern. He thought about the people who had installed it. Anonymous technicians with exact hands and scheduled breaks, sleeves rolled to forearms, talking about their families while heat baked the joints flat. He took comfort in imagining those careful, ordinary movements. The loudest voices in the gallery always sounded as if triumph grew from thunder. He knew that most victories grew from small motions completed without witnesses. An instructor with hurricane eyes materialized at Mason's elbow, as if anger required no travel time. Commander Alsan kept his voice low. Remember the 3rd clause, Cadet Hale? Mason nodded. No powered tools. The one after that. No drones. After that. No chemical agents beyond field ration contents. Alsan's mouth cut sideways. Interpretation decides survival. Interpretation is the weapon you are allowed. Let the others bring size and speed. You bring grammar." He left without ceremony, coat flaring once at the turn. Mason exhaled and reviewed his pockets. The pre-test search had stripped obvious contraband and anything that resembled a tool by common sense. The monitors had missed the useless bits only because uselessness had a way of looking forgettable. A knotted loop of rubber bands in khaki tone, a handful of paper clips in dull steel, a stub of a broken pencil, a strip of fabric torn from the inside hem of a jacket he would never wear in front of anyone who voted on promotions, a thin card sleeve from a ration bar he had eaten on the walk to muster. He touched the rubber bands through cloth. The texture steadied him. Months ago, he had watched a maintenance technician, a woman with a grease line across one cheek, snap a band around a loose conduit while the power was down. She had grinned at him and called the trick cheating. He had filed the word away and rolled it on his tongue later in the empty gym. Every culture drew the line between cheating and ingenuity at a different angle. Winning meant standing on the correct side of the line with both feet and smiling like a saint. Sirens swept in a rising glide. The gates at the southern cordon ratcheted open, bars lifting with a clank that felt deliberate, a soundtrack chosen to remind young minds that nothing important ever opened quietly. Mason moved with the flow without surrendering to it. The Vorthons surged first, a tide of mass shaped by habit. A tall captain named Serac, Mason remembered the name because the man had once given him a nod at a mess line, barked assignments in a bass that made nearby scaffolds hum. Mason watched how that sound carried and marked the lines of force it created in the air. He let the Vorthons sweep left, toward the wider avenue that promised speed but guaranteed obvious lines of approach. The Remnari split into pairs and vanished into the ruins in the way a thought can vanish when a person reaches for it. The Thrix climbed before any others had considered elevation, skittering up the scaffolds with unembarrassed precision. Mason chose the middle ground, not the silence of ghosts and not the volume of mountains. He cut right through a market ruin where overturned stalls still showed faded festival paint. Paper streamers clung to a support beam in sun-bleached pastel, immovable from old static, trembling minutely in the dome's climate breeze. He let the colors pass and imagined hands tying knots, fingers smudged by dye. He listened for the balance point between too much caution and bravado. The rules lived in that balance. At a broken kiosk, he paused and crouched. The counter had been shattered in a convincing arc, as if a panicked vendor had thrown a body across it in a last attempt at salvation. Beneath the splintered planks lay a cluster of small boxes strewn like coins after a spill. He cracked one and found metal clips that had once held display cards upright. He palmed what he could and slid the rest into a pouch stitched into the inner seam of his uniform. A private edition he had made with an instructor's permission and a needle borrowed from a medic. He kept moving. A second siren burst signaled the official start. The scoreboard on the western gantry lit with icons representing squads and individual entrants. Mason did not look up. Looking up in the first 90 seconds would teach the wrong lesson. The field needed to enter his body through boot soles, not through a screen. He passed a pile of collapsed mesh that had once formed a shade canopy. The anchors were intact. He lifted one and turned it in his palm. The head of the anchor had a gap the width of a coin and a lip with a shallow bite. He slid a paper clip through the hole and felt the lock of friction. He replaced the anchor and tucked the image of the fit into memory. Ahead, the street narrowed to a throat where three buildings leaned toward one another like conspirators. Mason stopped at the edge of shadow and let his vision settle. A Remnari scout in gray stood in the gloom with a stillness that advertised danger to anyone who had learned to fear statues. Mason did not step. The scout, Mason recognized her because she had once lapped him twice on the track and had offered him water without comment, held a palm over a knee sensor, and waited for impatience to expose a rival. Mason backed up without turning and slipped down a side lane that curved in a crooked S between two crumbling shelters. He told himself that refusing a first fight was not cowardice. Refusal was handwriting on the first page of a long report. The central zone lay 3 blocks north and 1 block east. Every route held a lesson about what could be trusted. He moved beneath a walkway and paused at the support column. Someone had drawn a target in charcoal at shoulder height and had scuffed a boot heel beneath it, the way nervous hands sometimes test a weapon's sight. He touched the smudge and then wiped the black across the back of his wrist to hide the print. He set the pencil stub against the column and marked a thin line at his own shoulder height to record where he had been in this exact second, not because he needed the mark, but because the act of drawing a line in the world always tightened his focus. He spoke in his head the clause about environmental hazards and censor bans and made the grammar click against his teeth. He wanted the rules to feel less like law and more like a material he could bend. Ahead, a whistle cut the air, high and quick. The gallery noise fell away in Mason's mind, as if someone had lowered a curtain. The whistle belonged to a Vorthon unit leader signaling a pivot. Mason pictured the angle and the new front that would form across the open plaza near the old fountain. He had stood by that fountain during a map brief and had shoved a finger into the drain to feel how grit collected in the corners where water slowed. He smiled without showing teeth. He could work corners. He could trust slowness. He jogged the last stretch to a warehouse shell that opened on the plaza's southern rim. Inside the shell, light striped the floor through a ceiling grid that had lost panels like teeth. A stack of empty crates formed a waist-high maze. He crouched behind the first stack and examined a broken pallet. The brittle slats begged to be snapped and turned into blades. He left them whole. The test did not punish violent impulse so much as unimaginative reflex. He looped a rubber band around the corner of the pallet and stretched it to the next crate, then to a bent pipe, then to a splinter that pointed outward like a warning. He paused and listened for the voice that wanted the sling to throw a stone. He heard it and let it talk itself to exhaustion. He did not throw. He released the band and felt the line of tension remain in him like a phantom limb. He tucked the band back into his pocket and rolled 2 paper clips into a figure-8 lock that could clamp onto a lattice without slipping. He felt the tiny machine in his fingers and imagined a dozen ways to pair it with weight and time. The plaza outside exploded into motion. A Vorthon charge hammered the tiles to Mason's right. A Remnari pair slipped across the fountain's rim with a grace that made speed look like stillness, and a Thrix cadet scrambled across scaffolding with the decisive rhythm of a person who had never fallen. The scoreboard cast new light across the plaza, a wash of shifting blues and reds that stained skin and armor. Mason stayed in shadow and counted breaths again, slow and precise. He had not yet sprung a trap. He had not yet taken a point. He had done nothing that would impress a spectator who came for spectacle. Good. The first chapter of any campaign had to open with restraint, or the last chapter would become a scramble of noise. He ran a thumb across the edge of a paperclip until skin tingled and then tucked it away. He whispered a number and then another and let courage become arithmetic. He felt the rules click into place inside his skull like parts of a patient machine. The game had begun, and he had not lost himself. That was the only promise he could make that would matter an hour from now, when the dome demanded a victor and the academy fed new legends to the hungry air. Mason kept his position in the warehouse shell until the vibrations of the first plaza clash faded into something less chaotic and more predictable. The Vorthons had formed their standard wedge and were driving Remnari scouts backward toward the northeast arcade. The Thrix cadet had claimed the scaffolding and was using height to relay hand signals to her ground team, her mandibles flashing faint reflections as she moved. None of this concerned him yet. He understood that his fight would not be about pushing lines or holding ground with brute force. His war would be fought in shadows, in overlooked spaces, in those fractions of seconds when opponents were certain they were safe. He eased away from the crates and moved deeper into the interior, toward a maintenance corridor that led to the old freight lift. The lift's cage was locked open, the floor panel removed so no one could ride it without risking a fall to the empty shaft. He crouched beside the edge, slipped a paper clip from his pocket, and bent it into a hook that could catch the lip of the grated floor. Then he slid the hook into place on a taut rubber band, braced the band against a support strut, and let it hang, an innocuous loop waiting for a weight that would never suspect it. He would come back for it later. The corridor opened into a storage bay where scattered debris littered the floor. Here, simulation designers had planted a selection of useless scrap meant to tease competitors into wasting time. Broken antenna rods, cracked polyglass panels, snapped circuit boards, anything that looked valuable at a glance but had no real function in the rule set. Mason sifted through the mess slowly, knowing speed was the enemy when attention was this valuable. He found a bundle of insulated wire about as thick as his little finger, coiled into a loose spiral. He wound it tighter, bent it into a figure 8, and looped a rubber band around the center until it bit into the insulation. The result looked like a child's slingshot stripped of elegance, but Mason saw its potential immediately. The wires would hold tension, the band would snap with force, and the whole assembly could be anchored to a crate handle or door hinge to create a sudden pull. He pocketed the tool and kept moving, careful to keep his head low. Every sound in this part of the simulation was magnified by the hollow shell of the walls. His boots barely touched the ground. The faint crunch of grit was lost beneath the distant clash of armored bodies. He followed the corridor to an exit hatch that had been welded open, stepping through into the shadow of a collapsed billboard frame. The panel lay at an angle, one corner buried in rubble. The frame's crossbeams were held together with steel bolts, and Mason noted how the loosened joints rattled when he tapped them. He imagined a paperclip chain looped through one of those bolts, a rubber band stretched to create tension, and a pebble wedged just so. The smallest movement from an unsuspecting opponent could release the pressure and send the bolt snapping free, collapsing part of the frame in a safe but sensor-triggering cascade. He smiled faintly. This place was full of such invitations, each waiting for someone to translate them into action. He crossed into a side street lined with the husks of market stalls. Faded cloth banners still fluttered overhead, their edges frayed into threadbare tassels. A Remnari scout darted across the far end of the lane, her movements a blur of fluid precision. She didn't see him. Her gaze was fixed on the plaza beyond. Mason flattened himself against the nearest stall and waited for her to vanish into the maze. When the way was clear, he crouched beside a stall leg and slid a paper clip between two slats of wood. He looped a rubber band through the clip, stretching it just enough to hold tension, then attached a shard of metal to the other end. The shard dangled inches above the stall's countertop, a harmless piece of junk unless someone brushed against the band. If that happened, the shard would swing into a nearby sensor node hidden under the lip of the roof, triggering an elimination for anyone in range. Satisfied, Mason moved on. He reached the northern edge of the market and found himself at the base of a half-collapsed pedestrian bridge. Above him, shattered railings leaned inward, and the deck was littered with chunks of polycrete. The incline to the top was steep but manageable. He climbed carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. From the top, he had a clear view of the Central Zone's southern approach. The plaza's fountain gleamed faintly under the dome lights, its dry basin ringed with cover positions that teams would fight over soon. He crouched low and scanned for opportunities. A Vorthon squad moved along the avenue to his left, shields raised in a disciplined line. They were sweeping debris aside, clearing a path that would let them rush the fountain in a straight push. Behind them, a Thrix cadet was lowering a rope from a scaffold, likely to give the squad an alternate angle. Mason noted both movements and then retreated from the bridge's edge. He didn't want his silhouette marked by any sharp-eyed opponent. He knelt beside a section of railing still clinging to its bolts. Using 2 paper clips, he fashioned a crude hinge, binding it with a rubber band to hold the rail steady. Then he loosened the bolts just enough that a sharp tug would send the section swinging inward. Positioned correctly, it could block the avenue below for several seconds, long enough to break the Vorthon's formation at a critical moment. When he finished, he descended the far side of the bridge into a quieter alley. Here, the air felt stiller, less stirred by the movements of combat. He passed a stack of barrels, their surfaces slick with simulated rainwater. He tested the weight of one and found it could be rolled with relative ease. He tucked the knowledge away. In the right position, even a barrel could become part of his unseen arsenal. Near the alley's end, he found a maintenance access door half hidden behind a collapsed awning. It was locked, but the hinges were exposed. He bent another paperclip into a wedge and slipped it between the hinge pin and bracket, testing the fit. If needed, he could work the pin free in seconds, creating a sudden open route where none had existed moments before. That kind of surprise could be more powerful than any direct attack. The distant hum of the scoreboard shifted, a change in tone that meant someone had just been eliminated. Mason listened for the cheers or groans that would follow from the galleries, but the sound was swallowed by the dome's size. He wasn't concerned with who had scored first blood. His focus was on the map forming in his head, a lattice of potential traps and diversions. Every corner he passed was another thread in that web, each paperclip and rubber band a knot waiting to tighten. By the time he reached the mouth of the alley, his pockets were lighter, but his territory was richer. He had left half a dozen small devices scattered through the southern quadrant, none of them obvious, all of them designed to work in combination rather than isolation. He looked toward the central zone again, gauging the pace of the battle by the distant movement of shadows. The opening moves were nearly done. Soon, the real game would begin. He tightened his grip on the last intact rubber band in his pocket and felt the smooth curve of a paperclip under his thumb. The materials were almost nothing in weight, but he knew they carried the potential to unbalance everything. The challenge ahead wasn't to strike first. It was to strike in a way that no one could see coming until the scoreboard lit with his advantage. He turned toward the heart of the field, ready to step into the next phase with his traps set, his routes memorized, and his patience sharpened into something that felt like a weapon in itself. Mason moved into the outer edge of the central zone as the chaos from the early skirmishes began to settle into tense stalemates. The soundscape had shifted, no longer the constant hammer of charges and countercharges, but the punctuated bursts of sudden encounters. The wide avenues were mostly abandoned now, every competitor preferring the tighter spaces where cover was plentiful and visibility limited. Mason kept to the shadow of a half-toppled statue, its stone face cracked down the middle, its once proud gaze now staring at the rubble beneath. He watched the fountain at the plaza's heart. The Vorthons had claimed the northern arc, their formation solid, shields locking into a semicircle that allowed them to hold the approach from 3 streets. To the east, a Remnari pair crouched low behind a collapsed kiosk, their hands flicking through quick signals. The Thrick's presence was harder to track. Mason had seen only brief flashes of movement on rooftops and scaffolds. He crouched and pressed his back against the statue's base, letting the battle's tempo guide his breathing. The moment for passive observation had passed. The traps he had scattered in the southern quadrant would hold as long as no one recognized them for what they were. Now he needed to start pulling threads, turning the web from a potential into a reality. He slipped one hand into his pocket and took out the last intact loop of khaki rubber bands he had. He split it into 2 smaller loops and wound them tightly around a bent paper clip until the metal bowed slightly under tension. Then he drew a pebble from the grid at his feet, set it into the loop, and tested the snap with his thumb. The pebble flew with a satisfying, silent flick. Mason allowed himself the briefest smile. The tool was ready. Keeping low, he crossed a narrow stretch of open ground and ducked into the skeletal remains of a building whose roof had caved in long ago. The walls were intact enough to shield him from direct view, and the jagged gaps in the ceiling let in broken shafts of light that illuminated dust motes drifting in slow spirals. From here, he could see one of the Vorthon shield-bearers leaning slightly out of formation to get a better angle on the Remnari position. Mason judged the distance and adjusted for the arc. The pebble left the loop in a blur, striking the Vorthon's upper arm sensor. The impact triggered a sharp chime, and the shield-bearer froze in surprise before retreating out of the simulation zone with a raised hand. Mason ducked deeper into the shadows before the rest of the squad could pinpoint where the shot had come from. The loss of one shield disrupted the Vorthon formation more than Mason had hoped. The gap on their right flank widened as they shifted to cover the absence, and the Remnari seized the opportunity, darting forward to press the attack. The Vorthons managed to repel them, but the momentary disorder forced them into a tighter, more defensive posture. Mason didn't linger to watch the resolution. His objective wasn't to wipe out either side, it was to weaken both, so that when the time came, neither could resist his final push. He slipped out the back of the ruined building and made his way through a service alley that wrapped around the central plaza. Here, he found another opportunity. A narrow archway connected two buildings, and under its shadow lay a loose coil of synthetic rope left from an earlier simulation. He crouched, unwound the coil into shorter lengths, and threaded paper clips through each end. Then he looped rubber bands through the clips to create spring-loaded tethers. He fixed one tether across the archway at ankle height and another at knee height, both blending into the shadowed stone. Anyone charging through without looking would trigger both, toppling forward and into the open. He set a small metal shard to dangle from the second band so that it would strike a nearby sensor pad when the band snapped back, ensuring an elimination. Before leaving, Mason ran his fingers lightly over the ropes to make sure they were taut, but not obvious. Satisfied, he moved on, skirting the outer edge of the plaza until he reached the opposite side. Here, the Thrix cadet was still positioned high on a scaffold, scanning for movement. Mason studied the structure's supports and spotted one beam where the bolts were already loose. He pulled a paperclip chain from his pocket, hooked it through the bolt's gap, and attached it to a rubber band looped around a ground-level pipe. Then he found a jagged brick and set it just inside the band's arc. If anyone tripped the setup, the bolt would drop, sending a section of the scaffold rattling down, not enough to injure, but enough to force the Thrix down into the open. With the trap in place, Mason backed away into a derelict storefront. The dusty shelves still held empty glass bottles and bits of shattered plastic. He cleared a space on the floor and laid out the few remaining components he had. 3 paper clips, 1 half-snapped rubber band, the broken pencil stub, and a scrap of mesh he had torn from a fence earlier. From these, he fashioned a crude snare that could be triggered by a simple trip line. He positioned it across the entrance to the store, anchoring one end to a display rack and the other to a cracked tile. If anyone followed him in, the mesh would sweep across at chest height, striking the nearest active sensor. By now, the simulation's background noise had shifted again. There were fewer clashes, more cautious footsteps. The surviving cadets had become wary, each movement deliberate. Mason knew that meant his traps were having an effect. Even the threat of an unseen strike was enough to slow the pace, and slowing the pace was exactly what he wanted. The longer the others hesitated, the more he could shape the battlefield to his advantage. He slipped out of the store and took position behind a collapsed wall with a partial view of the fountain. The Vorthons were still holding their arc, though it was thinner now, and the Remnari were circling like patient predators. The Thrix had vanished from the scaffold. Whether by her own choice or because someone had sprung Mason's trap, he couldn't tell. Either way, it meant another variable had shifted in his favor. He pressed his hand against the cool stone of the wall and let the situation settle into his mind. The web was tightening. Every step he had taken since entering the central zone was feeding into a single, inevitable moment. He didn't need to rush. The field was his now, even if no one else knew it yet. Mason crouched lower, pulling a fresh pebble into the loop of his improvised launcher. He watched the plaza, not for the next target, but for the next crack in someone's confidence. That was where he would strike, not for points, not for spectacle, but to tilt the balance just enough that, when the final seconds came, the last shape standing in the fountain's shadow would be his own. Mason stayed motionless in the shadow of the collapsed wall, the plaza's noise folding over him in uneven waves. He had built enough pressure into the field to make his presence felt without revealing his position, but now came the part that would define the outcome: the shift from unseen influence to direct control. The scoreboard glowed with fewer icons now, the earlier chaos distilled into a handful of survivors, each more cautious than the last. Every second that passed made the air feel tighter, the tension almost physical. He scanned the plaza's approaches, counting the rhythm of footsteps and mapping them against the memory of where his traps waited. The Vorthon squad was down to 3 members, clustered together in a tight wedge that now faced the southeast approach. The Remnari pair had vanished from view entirely, which told him they were circling through the narrower service lanes. The absence of the Thrix was a variable he had to respect. If she had escaped his scaffold trap, she would be looking for high ground again. Mason decided it was time to make the first deliberate push toward the central zone. He shifted out of cover and moved along the edge of the fountain's western quadrant, keeping low and using the broken line of market stalls for concealment. His fingers brushed the last intact loop of rubber band in his pocket, and he thought about the precision with which he needed to use it. The central zone was now the focus of every surviving competitor. Any mistake in movement would be punished instantly. He slipped into the shade of a shattered archway, from which he could see the fountain's base more clearly. The dry basin offered a kind of deceptive safety. Its walls were low enough to provide cover from ground-level fire, but it left anyone inside exposed to attacks from above. That made it the perfect bait. Mason's plan relied on creating just enough commotion in the basin to draw at least one of the remaining opponents into a mistake. He reached into his jacket's hidden seam and took out 2 paper clips he had kept in reserve. He bent them into a loose chain and hooked one end to a stone fragment the size of his palm. Using the rubber band, he created a tension sling between 2 low posts that had once held decorative banners. The stone sat balanced in the center, its weight pressing against the band's stretch. With a slight adjustment, he aimed the sling toward a cluster of loose tiles inside the basin. A quick release sent the stones skidding across the tiles, creating a sudden clatter loud enough to mimic the sound of someone dropping gear. The reaction came quickly. One of the Vorthons turned toward the noise and signaled to the others. The wedge formation shifted, 2 members holding position while the third moved forward to investigate. Mason watched as the heavy boots crossed the plaza's open ground, the distance closing between the Vorthon and the basin. Just before the soldier reached the rim, Mason moved along the archway's shadow to a position behind him. With careful timing, he plucked another paperclip from his pocket and looped it through the edge of the Vorthon's shield strap. A quick tug pulled the strap off balance, just enough to make the shield tip forward. The motion startled the Vorthon, who stumbled sideways into one of Mason's earlier tripline traps near the basin's corner. The rope snapped, the metal shard swung, and the elimination chime rang out. The Vorthon froze, then stepped back in frustration, leaving his squad weaker still. The disruption in their line was immediate. The 2 remaining Vorthons turned their attention fully toward the fountain, trying to anticipate where the attack had come from. Mason didn't wait for them to find an answer. He slid back into the market stalls, circling toward the northeast side of the plaza, where he suspected the Remnari were waiting. As he approached, a flicker of movement confirmed his guess. One of the slender figures was crouched in the shadow of a pillar, the other scaling a low wall to get a vantage point. Mason knew that if the Remnari gained a higher position, they could control the plaza's approaches with ease. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last of his pre-bent paperclip chains. This one had been twisted into a tighter loop for stability. He spotted a loose decorative panel hanging from the wall the Remnari was climbing. Hooking the chain around a protruding nail, he attached it to a rubber band stretched between 2 beams. Then he picked up a small shard of rubble and wedged it under the band's edge. A gentle flick of the shard's base sent it flying upward to tap the panel. The impact loosened the already unstable panel, which fell forward and struck the Remnari's shoulder sensor with a hollow clang. Another chime rang out, and the climber dropped back to the ground, eliminated before gaining any advantage. The second Remnari reacted instantly, moving toward the fallen teammate's position, but Mason had already slipped into the cover of a nearby ruin. He could hear the soft patter of feet as the alien closed in, searching for the source of the strike. Mason crouched behind a half-collapsed doorway and waited. When the shadow of the Remnari fell across the threshold, Mason snapped his rubber band taut around a paperclip hook, pulling it against the doorframe. A quick release sent the hook snagging onto the Remnari's gear strap, yanking it into a sensor panel Mason had spotted earlier on the wall. The elimination was clean, fast, and silent enough that the Vorthons on the opposite side of the plaza would not immediately realize the Remnari were gone. With the eastern threat removed, Mason focused his attention back on the central zone. The two remaining Vorthons were still holding their position, though their movements were sharper now, their heads turning more often to check blind spots. They knew the field had shifted against them. Mason took advantage of their caution, moving into the open with deliberate slowness, using the fountain's rim as partial cover. His approach was calm, measured, as if he belonged there. The Vorthons hesitated, unsure if engaging him would expose them to another unseen trap. That hesitation was exactly what he needed. He reached the fountain's edge and climbed into the basin, crouching low. From here, the geometry of the plaza worked in his favor. Anyone approaching would have to expose themselves for at least a few seconds before reaching him. He set his remaining supplies on the basin floor, 2 bent paper clips and a length of thin cord he had taken earlier from the market stalls. He looped the cord between 2 of the basin's decorative posts and attached the paper clips at intervals, each under light tension. The makeshift barrier was nearly invisible against the basin's shadows, but strong enough to catch an ankle or knee. As the Vorthons began their cautious advance toward the fountain, Mason crouched deeper and felt the stillness settle into his muscles. Every trap, every diversion, every calculated strike had brought the field to this exact balance point. Now all that remained was to tip it. He adjusted his grip on the last intact rubber band in his possession, the one he had guarded through the entire match. Its loop was smooth and warm against his fingers, the weight of possibility pressing into his palm. When the moment came, he would use it, and the scoreboard would decide what kind of legend the dome would remember. The 2 remaining Vorthons advanced on the fountain with a caution that looked almost ceremonial. Their shields were angled forward, steps measured, eyes sweeping the basin for the ambush they knew must be waiting. Mason crouched low, one hand on the fountain's cool stone, his other hand curled around the last rubber band like it was the smallest and most dangerous weapon in the galaxy. He could feel the air tighten with each step they took, every movement pulling the moment toward an inevitable clash. The plaza had gone quieter. The galleries high above were holding their breath, sensing that the contest was narrowing to its final moves. Mason knew a head-on attack against 2 shielded opponents would be suicide, even in a simulation. His advantage lay in making them move where he wanted. The cord and paperclip barrier stretched low across the basin was his first piece of leverage. The second was the geometry of the basin itself, a shallow oval with raised edges, forcing anyone entering to lift a leg just high enough to be momentarily off balance. He watched the nearest Vorthon step onto the rim, the heavy shield tilting slightly as the warrior adjusted to the uneven surface. Mason's body reacted before thought fully formed. He snapped the rubber band taut with a paperclip hooked to its center and let it fly. The hook clinked against the lower edge of the Vorthon's shield, catching on the strap and pulling just enough to make the large warrior stumble. The shift in balance carried the Vorthon's leg directly into the cord trap. The snap was almost inaudible, but the result was instant. The Vorthon pitched forward, striking a sensor embedded in the basin's interior wall. The chime of elimination rang clear, and the first of the 2 dropped out of the match. The remaining Vorthon froze for half a second, torn between helping his partner and keeping his shield up. That hesitation was all Mason needed. He lunged sideways, rolling along the basin floor to put the eliminated warrior's shield between himself and the last opponent. He gripped the rim of the shield and shoved it forward, not as an attack, but as a decoy, letting it clatter loudly against the basin wall. The sound drew the Vorthon's attention, his stance shifting toward where he thought Mason would emerge. Instead, Mason slipped in the opposite direction, darting to the edge of the basin near one of the posts he had marked earlier. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the broken pencil stub, the last physical object he had that could serve as both tool and distraction. He flicked it high over the Vorthon's head. The small arc of motion caught the light just enough to make the warrior glance up. In that split second, Mason dropped low, hooked his fingers under the basin's rim, and vaulted over it to the plaza floor. His boots landed in the space between the Vorthon and the fountain, cutting off the most direct path back to the objective. The big warrior turned sharply, but his shield's bulk made it slow to reposition in such tight quarters. Mason didn't try to overpower him. Instead, he sidestepped into the line where the basin's shadow met the plaza's open light. Here, the reflective tiles created a faint glare, enough to make any sudden movement harder to track. He feinted left, then spun right, driving his shoulder into the Vorthon's back to push him toward the rim. The warrior braced, trying to counter the shove, but his heel caught on the basin's edge. Mason pressed the advantage, slipping one last paperclip from his pocket and sliding it into the gap between the shield strap and the Vorthon's armor joint. With a twist, he hooked it to the nearest sensor mount on the rim. The contact triggered the final chime, and the last Vorthon froze, eliminated. The scoreboard above flared with Mason's icon as the sole remaining competitor in the central zone. The galleries erupted, a layered roar of disbelief and admiration. From the stands, he could hear the distant, distinct sound of someone laughing in that half-incredulous way that meant they had just watched a rule book rewritten in real time. He didn't raise his arms or bow. He just stood in the fountain's shadow, chest heaving slowly, letting the moment anchor itself in his memory. The simulation field's sirens signaled the end of the match. Mason stepped out of the basin, his boots crunching on the fine grit scattered across the tiles. The eliminated cadets were already making their way toward the southern cordon, heads high despite their losses. Some looked at him with guarded respect, others with the calculation of rivals already thinking about next time. He could read in their eyes the acknowledgement that what had happened here couldn't be dismissed as luck. It had been precision, patience, and the ability to see weapons in objects no one else had bothered to notice. Commander Alsan appeared near the field's edge, arms folded, expression unreadable until Mason was close enough to see the faint upward tilt at the corner of his mouth. "Interpretation," the commander said, the single word carrying the weight of everything Mason had just done. Mason nodded once, the answer silent but complete. He didn't need to explain that every move he had made had started with that single idea: interpret the rules until they bent, but never so far that they broke. As he left the simulation dome, the distant echo of the crowd still following him, Mason felt no need for celebration. The victory was its own reward. But more than that, it was proof. Proof that in a contest where strength was measured in bulk and force, a human could redefine the terms of battle with nothing more than a handful of paper clips, a few rubber bands, and the stubborn belief that there is no such thing as an object without purpose. Somewhere behind him, the plaza's traps still sat in silence, their work done, their presence invisible to anyone who hadn't walked the paths he had. The field would be cleared soon, the debris swept away, the stage reset for the next match. But the lesson would linger in the minds of everyone who had been there to see it, that the smallest tools in the right hands could win the largest wars.